These two organizations have been advocating for fair competition, for a level playing field for workers, for consumers, for small business owners and innovators and entrepreneurs for over 2 decades at this point. And it's a tough haul, as many of you know. So we're based in DC, but we work all over. And our work covers the gamut from food and agriculture to healthcare to transportation, airlines, for example. We do a lot of work in legal advocacy, filing briefs in the appellate courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court. We do a lot of white papers, economic and policy analysis of mergers and other competitive issues in a wide variety of industries. And we could not do the work that we do without talking to people like you, who give us incredible information and insight and perspective on how the markets are actually working, or in many cases, not working. And we fight very hard to combat abusive exercise of market power, whether it's monopolies, whether it's anti-competitive mergers, or whether it is cartels, where we see a lot of price fixing. So today I wanted to give you probably another depressing update on what's going on in antitrust. And I don't have a long presentation. I'm very happy to take questions and have some discussion afterwards. So there's about 5 things I want to cover. I want to talk about enforcement under the Trump agencies. And what I mean by agencies are there 2 federal agencies, the US Department of Justice Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission. I want to talk about what those agencies have been up to or not up to recently and in the past, and how that affects and impacts the food and agriculture industries. I want to talk about the supply chain in food and ag, because this is really a problem in that we have very high levels of market concentration with just a few rivals, lots of consolidation in critical parts of the supply chain, almost to the point where it looks like an hourglass, very bottlenecked in the midstream section where there's processing, manufacturing, and the like. And then I want to talk about state activism. We're seeing a real uptick in the involvement of state attorney generals in merger enforcement in particular, but they serve a very vital role, as do private enforcers. And there are many pending private cases, antitrust cases involving food and agriculture. We'll talk about that. And then I want to just leave you with some closing thoughts in ways that you can better tune or think about tuning your advocacy for the markets in which you participate. So let's start. This may not be a popular notion for some of you, but it's true. Okay, here we go. We've seen really, really weak enforcement under the Trump administration. And this is probably part of a bigger gestalt, for a lack of a better term, to really keep the government out of the markets, to limit government oversight, to limit the ability of government to interfere or to play referee in the markets. I'm a progressive. I'm a firm believer. I wouldn't have the job I have with a progressive organization if we didn't think that the government plays a really vital role in some cases, not through invasive regulation, but through market oversight by enforcement of the antitrust laws, particularly in our economy today, where we see extremely high levels of market concentration and just a few players in key industries and big dominant firms in others. So the Federal Trade Commission, for example, when we moved from the Bush administration, this is Bush 2, to Obama, we saw 13% more merger challenges in that transition. We now see 42% fewer merger challenges under the first 2 years of the Trump administration than we saw under Obama. And by the way, just for the record, we have and will continue to criticize, when necessary, any administration when we see weak enforcement. It's not a partisan thing. US Department of Justice, and we'll talk a bit about how these agencies divide up the food and ag supply chain. 51% more merger challenges under Obama than under Bush 2. 46% fewer merger challenges under Trump than Obama. These are not good statistics. in terms of how the agencies are enforcing Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which is the merger statute in the United States. Even worse, we've seen the evisceration of the Packers and Stockyards Act under this administration. The administration has canceled all proposed reforms, rulemakings, changes that actually would have strengthened the PSA, and just recently eliminated GIPSA as a separate agency and moved it over under USDA, I believe, to the Agricultural Marketing Authority. So it's not an independent agency anymore, which is not a good development. All right, so this graph just puts what I just said into graphical form. You can see merger challenges under Bush. You can see how they rose under Obama, particularly for the Department of Justice, and how they have fallen dramatically under the current administration. And remember, we're only 2 years in terms of having the data to assess that. There's 2 more years to go, but we're not seeing anything that would indicate that there will be any change in this real dip in merger enforcement. All right, let's take a look at what the federal antitrust agencies actually do in food and agriculture. And many of you know this, so I apologize for the repeat, but it's always good to get a little refresher. Essentially, the 2 agencies split up the supply chain. They split it in half, right in half. And the Federal Trade Commission takes all downstream markets and assess and deals with competitive concerns, whether it's mergers, monopolies, or cartels in the downstream segments. So that's food manufacturing, it's food distribution, and it's retail grocery. They have approved, the Federal Trade Commission has approved successive mergers in food and ag in those sectors over the last 20, 30 years. So, and you know what these are. You know, Heinz has acquired multiple other food manufacturers. Kroger has acquired other grocery store chains. Ahold, same thing in the supermarket space. So we're seeing successive acquisitions creating very large, dominant players in these sectors. What does the US DOJ do? Well, they take the upper half of the supply chain. They look at all of the agro inputs, chemicals, seed technology, farm machinery. They also take producers, anything involving antitrust matter involving producers, and they take the processors. So that would be the packers, the poultry producers, the poultry processors, and the like. DOJ is the only agency that deals with criminal violations. So these would be criminal violations under Section 1 of the Sherman Act, which is essentially the anti-conspiracy statute. The FTC does not deal with criminal violations. The DOJ as well has also approved successive multiple mergers by the same companies. The big one here would be Monsanto. Monsanto has acquired their way to dominance in the traits, seeds, and chemicals markets. But we've also seen packers repeatedly coming to the till to acquire smaller rivals. We just saw Iowa Premium and National Beef go through without a second request, which was a disappointment. There's really no clear coordination as far as we can tell, and we're very close to the agencies. We have good relationships with them, and we interact with them on a regular basis. We're just not seeing any coordination between the agencies. And that should be very troubling because of the nature of the supply chain and how the different parts of the supply chain interact with one another, all the way up from production down to retail grocery and the consumer. And because of this lack of coordination, we think that's a reason why we're seeing so much consolidation and concentration in the supply chain. So this pie chart just sort of, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So everything on the left side is an FTC matter. So anything involving retail grocery, food distribution, food manufacturing is taken by the FTC, okay? And that's about 56% of all cases, federal cases that we see, major federal cases. The DOJ, on the other hand, is taking anything involving agricultural inputs and processing. So most of the activity is over at the FTC, and they have been pummeled with merger after merger after merger in this downstream part of the supply curve. Remember, the agencies have limited resources. They can only afford to litigate 2 or 3 major cases a year, and they just don't have the wherewithal to be able to go after every single harmful merger or potential monopolization concern or potential agreement. Okay, so now that we have sort of the lay of the land, I want to just share thoughts with you on how the dynamics within the supply chain work and why they're so troubling. So what has happened is there's been a tremendous amount of downstream consolidation, right? Retail grocers, food manufacturers. To the FTC's credit, they did block the merger of Cisco and US Foods, which would have been a merger to monopoly in broadline food distribution, but they blocked it, so good for them. But regardless, that's just a small slice of the pie chart you just saw. We've seen huge consolidation downstream. And so that creates powerful buyers, right? The grocery stores, the big national chains are powerful. They're powerful in negotiating with food manufacturers, with processors, even with independent producers, right? And so what does that do? Well, that triggers upstream consolidation. So the processors and some of the producers, the dairy co-ops and whatnot, they have every incentive to bulk up, to become bigger, so that they can bargain more effectively with these powerful downstream buyers. And you see this all the time. You see it all the time in your daily workaday lives. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The problem is it reverberates through the supply chain. So bulking up downstream triggers bulking up upstream. And before you know it, we have really high concentration with very few sellers, very few players at each market level. And that's a problem when you only have 2 or 3 major sellers in every segment. And then you have all the eaters at the bottom of the supply chain, and you have all the producers at the top of the supply chain. So this is what it looks like, right? So we've got a bunch of growers, producers, whatever you want to call them. We've got marketing and risk management, and the smaller the bubble, the more concentrated it is. The fewer the competitors we have in that market. Down through processing, right, smack in the middle of the supply chain at that bottleneck, right, all the way down to food manufacturing, wholesale distribution, food service, retail grocery. So we have a bottlenecked food and supply chain in the United States as a result of very, very lax merger enforcement, not just under this administration, but under previous administrations as well. All right, so just to put a point on it, just looking at retail grocery, tremendous growth in M&A. We've seen failed divestitures. So when a remedy is taken by the FTC or their DOJ, so they approve the merger subject to a remedy, and that actually has to be approved by a federal judge, a district court judge. They will sometimes require divestitures to reduce the market power of the merged company. They may require what we call conduct remedies, sort of rules and regulations and requirements about what the company can and cannot do. Well, in Safeway Albertsons, which was essentially a 2-to-1 merger to monopoly in many grocery store markets on the West Coast, they sold their stores to Hagen, which is a regional Northwest grocer. Within 10 months, Hagen had failed. They shuttered their stores and they closed them. So that was a failed remedy. And the costs of that to consumers and local economies are, as you can imagine, incredible. Top 4 food manufacturers in 2012 controlled 60%, north of 60% of sales in 100 categories of groceries. That's really high concentration, right? The problem with grocery stores, as you know, which is why a lot of you market your products outside of these sort of grocery store channels in alternative distribution channels, is it looks like there's a huge amount of competition. There's this brand proliferation. We have thousands and thousands of brands, but they're all controlled by 4 manufacturers, right? So consumers who aren't always the smartest people around go into a store and they think, oh, well, this is terrific. But it's really not, because they're paying prices that reflect the market power of just a few a few grocers. And so what we see at the store level is a lot of coordination, anti-competitive coordination, call it collusion if you want, on things like marketing costs, slotting fees, paying to get your stuff on the shelves, and also on category captains, where a single company is selected to manage the category in the store. And if that category captain is a powerful market player, you can imagine how other market players are disadvantaged by that. All right, so we all know about oligopolies. Oligopolies are just markets with a few firms. High concentration. Sometimes there's a dominant firm sitting in there in that oligopoly. You might even call it a cartel in some cases where they explicitly collude. And that means that it's much easier to collude than to compete, engage in hard-nosed head-to-head competition. Multiple effects of that, of these tight oligopolies we see in all these segments. We get monopoly power, seller power, higher prices to consumers, lower quality, higher barriers to entry. But for you, the real concern is monopsony power or buyer power, where we see lower prices to producers. They're pushed down by powerful packers, for example, or poultry processors. Also, farmers, producers are also squeezed on the top end by higher input costs, technology costs. We do a lot of work with the farmers. They're paying, sky-high prices for traits and seeds and chemicals. There's machinery, there's fertilizer. I mean, you know the story. So if those input costs go up and you're getting less money for your output in the commodity markets, you're being squeezed. And that's reflected in lower income and a shrinking of the base of family farms in the US. So because of all this, we've had a rash of recent price fixing cases. Most of these are private. There are cases raging on in broiler chickens, both on the buyer side and also on the sell side. We have the pork AgriStats case, which alleges collusion by AgriStats, which is basically a data company, providing information, competitive sensitive information that actually allows rivals to collude on prices and other variables. We've got cases in beef packing. Thank goodness for Bill Bullard and all of his hard work to help bring that case. And of course, we've had, let me go back here. Maybe I won't go back. We've had cases in canned tuna. There was really a very egregious case involving price fixing in canned tuna. All right, let's talk about the potential for state activism. If the feds aren't going to enforce the antitrust laws, then the states hopefully would step in and see the void, see the harms to competition, to consumers, to producers, and they would bring more cases. So in theory, we should see more state-level enforcement and more private enforcement. Remember, the system in the US is a dual system of public and private enforcement. Private rights of action, first country ever to have private rights of action. We've now been copied, that system, in many European countries. Take the Sprint T-Mobile merger, for example, was just approved by the DOJ. This is a 4-3 merger. So if you don't like your high wireless prices, chances are those are going to go up even more, because with 3 players in wireless carriers, we're probably going to have more incentives to collude than to compete hard on price and quality and innovation, right? What happened? Well, 15 states filed a complaint to sue the merger of Sprint and T-Mobile. This is unprecedented. The states have never done this before. I think they did it in an oil refining merger, but that pales in comparison to a merger of national wireless carriers. So the states are all over this stuff, and they are on the move. So first major merger where the states have sued to block. And remember, many states have their own antitrust laws, right? There's some really good websites where you can go and see which laws govern which states, but California, for example, has the Cartwright Act, which is a really strong statute in terms of bringing claims for competitive harm. And this is a really interesting chart. I want to just show this to you. This actually presents the number of cases filed by the states, all 50, and the feds, all one of them, and the 2 agencies over the last, several decades. So what do you see? Well, all the blue bars are the states. Now remember, a lot of states, so they're filing more cases, right? And of course, what you see with the feds is a lower number of cases, because they don't, there's only one of them and there's 50 states. But that's not what's important. What's important is that the activism, the period of activism where the states were really on the move and the feds were really on the move, really occurred in the 1990s. So where you see that sort of hump there for both the blue bars and the orange bars, that was in the mid-1990s. And that was a period of pretty aggressive antitrust enforcement. What have we seen since? That is flat. Everything from 2004 onward is flat. There is no increase in enforcement. It is weak and sporadic. And that is why we are dealing with the supply chain that looks like an hourglass, where we have high concentration at these various levels. All right, role of private enforcement, really, really, really important. My organization is a huge supporter of private enforcement. And we do a lot. We do an entire conference every year on private enforcement. We get involved in cases, filing briefs, suggesting that the courts opine one way or the other on the issue. Private settlements obtain restitution for victims. It's treble damages, and that hurts. That can really hurt. The feds can't do that. They can send people to jail for price fixing. They can get penalties, corporate penalties. They can do slap on the hands. You have to disgorge your ill-gotten gains, but it doesn't hurt unless you're going to jail. But that's an exception. That's just for criminal price fixing violations. But private settlements obtain treble damages, and that hurts. And so that's restitution for victims, and it also has a deterrence value for future violations. Most of these cases, most of the private cases are in fact price fixing cases. There's very few monopoly cases and almost no merger cases, okay? We're hoping that changes. In fact, we just saw a really great private case challenging a consummated merger. So we're hoping that maybe we'll see more of that and private enforcers can be persuaded to take the chance to bring those cases. Cases settled between 2013 and 2015. This is fresh data, just right out of some sources, and we were very involved in this project, show significant settlements for victims of anti-competitive abuses. Also, cases resolved in a relatively short period of time. So you're not in court for 15 years, trying to get a verdict, or trying to get the class certified, or trying to get the settlement certified. And so this graph just sort of puts into graphical form what I just said. You can see over time, in 2013, all the way up to 2018, the growth in private settlements. These are treble damages settlements in price fixing cases. You can see the growth in that over time, and in each of the categories that are broken down within each of those columns. So private enforcement, really important. State enforcement, really important. If the feds aren't going to do it, then we need our other private and state level enforcers to step in. Food for thought. Take your concerns to your states, your attorney generals, and to private enforcers. They will listen. They may not have, you may get a lot of questions. In fact, you absolutely will get a lot of questions. And it's a heavy lift, but you should be informing your state enforcers and private enforcers who will listen, and many of them will, about what your competitive concerns are. Weigh in on proceedings to oppose federal settlements involving harmful mergers. So I just testified in district court for the District of Columbia in the CVS Aetna merger. So pharmacy benefit manager and health insurer. The judge has to sign off on a settlement, which typically contains some sort of remedy, whether it's a divestiture or other requirements. Until that judge signs off on that settlement, the merger, in theory, cannot be consummated. It cannot go through. So this is an opportunity to be vocal and to express your concerns and get involved and file comments in these types of proceedings. They're called Tunney Act proceedings, to weigh in on what you perceive to be harmful mergers. Continue to mark U.S. products on the basis of quality and sustainability. My talk is not about foreign ownership in the United States. That's a whole nother talk. But Bottom line, U.S. producers stand the best chance of protecting their markets and promoting their goods, their products, on the basis of quality and on the basis of innovative, sustainable food production models and distribution models. And that's why country of origin labeling, in our view, is really so vitally important to help U.S. producers differentiate their products from non-U.S. products, which come with not insignificant concerns about quality, about safety, and about health risks. Push your legislators to increase their scrutiny of foreign transactions under CFIUS. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Chuck Grassley down in Iowa a couple of years ago managed to get food and ag onto the list of sort of national security type industries or sectors. So that was a good move. But we need to do more with CFIUS. The food supply chain is not only about economics, it's about public health, it's about public safety, and it's about a backbone of the American economy, right? And regional economies in a very large, geographically diverse country. So push your legislators to increase scrutiny of foreign transactions under CFIUS. And I would talk up what's happened to the Packers and Stockyards Act. The act has been eviscerated. And Peter Carstensen, who many of you know up at the University of Wisconsin, is really the guru on PSA. But talk about how those proposed rule changes that would have made it easier to enforce the PSA have been abandoned, and how GIPSA is now been blended in with another agency and no longer has independent agency standing. And I think that's it. Thank you for your attention.